Welcome all. This is Victorian Vanguard, and I am your host Ritam Datto. And today we have a very special guest, and she is none other than Pratyusha Dhar, and she is a very close friend of mine. And we did our masters together from University of Delhi. But unfortunately and fortunately, now she is in USA doing her PhD from University of Connecticut. And today she will going to speak on this topic, homosexuality and Victorian England. Over to you, Pratyusha, and I'm really glad that you accepted this proposal to come here. Uh,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ritam. Firstly, thank you for taking this initiative. And I feel that it's a wonderful initiative and it's a wonderful idea. And I couldn't be more honored to be the speaker for this series that you're proposing. And I think, it's going to help in the long run. It's going to be really helpful for students, not only students who are studying. Uh, Victorian literature or anything, but like even outside that, it's so interesting and like really, really, really impressive kind of work that you're doing. Um,
Thank
and
you.
thank you for the wonderful
Uh,
introduction as well.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for the compliments. And we will start the discussion a bit. But how tell you something about your weather? I mean, how this whole journey and the weather is.
So I have like so far I am enjoying the States. It's, rather like I have mixed reactions to uh, most of the things here because uh, I am, of course, missing my home, missing India. But also at the same time, I am receptive to the kind of, you know, uh, life that America is offering me, and especially like the East Coast where University of Connecticut is located. So uh, the weather, yeah. So today, unfortunately, the weather is a little too gloomy, and I had to, as you can see, probably I had to like turn the lights on. It's daytime,
Okay.
but I had to have the lights on because it's otherwise it would be like so dark inside. What about Kolkata weather? I think it's I don't know. What's the time right
Yeah,
now? It's really late,
it's
isn't
really
it?
hot. I mean, it's I think we are about to touch December, but still you are still sweating whenever you're going out. So the weather is not formidable here, but the weather
Yeah,
that you are talking about is a bit spooky, and I'm sure you are
it is. It is.
I'm sure you are missing food as well. I know.
Don't get me started on that, Ritam. I'm missing food terribly, like terribly. Like, but I'm trying to like also you know, cook my own food, which is the nearest to the home food that I can get, uh, juggling between like time management, teaching, and studying. So, yeah, I'm coping up.
Okay, so it must be very hectic, and thank you again for joining this. And I'm really glad that you accepted this proposal. So let's just begin this thing, and you can take your time, just uh, do your magic.
No, I just wanted to like, yeah, so mm, I'm not like, I don't know much about Victorian literature as a whole. I mean, I'm sure like nobody does, but I wanted to like recently I came upon this in some of the interesting scholarship on uh, the homosexual uh, part in Victorian England, especially, and that got me like fascinated so much that I thought that this could be like a great um, theme to talk about for your project. So thank you for like letting me talk about this before anything else. So the time period that I want to focus on for charting the homosexuality in Victorian England would be the the end of century, like end of the 19th century. So towards the end, by the end of 19th century, I mean, uh, probably from the 1880s and forwards, like from 1880s to um, it's only like 2 decades to the modern age, right? So within those 2 decades, a lot of things were happening in Victorian England, homosexuality wise. So just wanted to like mention that this. this end of 19th century that we are talking about, it's like every other age throughout history, it's also really, really transitional. So a lot of exchanges were happening, a lot of uh, processes and movements and transitions were informing this phase. So you might recall the the art for art's sake movement,
Exactly.
and the yeah, the heavy reliance on art movements, it was not only limited to to England, but also, the entire exchange and reliance on art movements was an international uh, was happening internationally. So we had like a lot of art movements, and all these countries, especially the European countries, they were like borrowing from each other. They were drawing from each other. So England borrowed a lot from France, from the art movements happening in France. So we have to name a few would be, the symbolism art movement, the decadence art movement, Art Nouveau, which kind of revolutionized the art scene. The reason why I'm like mentioning the art movement so much is because, um, you know, um, there was a shift from the strictly written medium of literature to a visual mode. Uh, do you get I mean, does it make sense? Like, people were like writing about art, drawing from art, trying to implement some of the art techniques in literature. So there was a heavy, heavy reliance on these art movements, which reached a peak in the 1890s. So uh, a lot of these kind of exchanges were happening, and popularly, these 2 decades were called uh, the fond des siècles. This is like a popular term for, which is like usually referred to this set of like 2 decades. So, uh, the fond des siècles movement, again, you can see like it's also borrowed from France. So, England was drawing like the cultural narrative of England was drawing a lot from these European countries, especially France. So uh, while part of England was focusing on the art movements and drawing from the art movements, there was another narrative that was going on, that was taking place parallelly to this, the reliance on art movements, and um, that was the reliance on Greek and Latin texts. So, as you can recall that, you know, uh, England is like, to be really, really frank, England has always been like an elitist country. So,
Okay.
uh, yeah, really,
That's
like,
a
yeah.
big
I mean,
statement.
I will like, if you look into it, like, so, how when I say that, uh, there was this parallel uh movement going on around around the reception of Greek and Latin texts. So I'm talking about those, upper class boys from upper class families who were entering the elite urban colleges like Oxford and Cambridge, which no one else, like, which not many people had access to. They could only go to those schools because they were from rich families. So they were like going to those schools. They were learning Greek and Latin texts, and then as a result of these Greek and Latin texts, so, like, okay, what is the first name that comes to mind when we are talking about some Greek literature? Like, what are a few handful of names that come to mind when we are talking about Greek literature? So,
I think the stories of Jews, and I mean, Greek literature is all about Jews, and then we have other big names like Sophocles is there. We have
yeah, yeah, we
Euripides.
have Plato.
Yes, we have Plato.
Yeah, Plato is like the most common name, right?
Exactly.
So, the reason why I threw this question was that, like, Plato is probably like after maybe Aristotle, but like Plato is by far, like, according to, I may not be right, but like, um Plato is like the most common name that people outside of the literature streams and disciplines also know about. Like if we say, okay, Greek literature, then people are like, oh, do you mean Plato? So,
Yes.
um, so these boys from the upper class families, some of them were some of them would later on uh, earn a lot of fame for their literature. For instance, like we have Matthew Arnold, we have uh, Thackeray, we have Tennyson, we have Clow, we have Walter Pater, we have Oscar Wilde. All these were boys from upper class families. So they would be, joining these elite. Uh, there's a term for it. They call it Oxbridge
Okay.
instead of, yeah. So like they would join these upper class schools and universities, and they would read Plato and Aristotle and Sophocles, and uh, yeah. So that the problem with this reception of Plato was that only people from the upper class could had access to that until
Okay.
until something really important happened, which I'm going to talk about now. So until then, until that important event, um, people only from the upper classes had access to Plato and Plato's writings. But most of the people, uh, other than those classes, they didn't know anything about Plato because uh, we did not have translations of Plato back in the 19th century. So it was this one guy called Benjamin Jowett who
Yes.
all of a sudden decides to like translate all the works of Plato into English. And that singular event changed the scenario, changed the literary scenario altogether because now even a common man can read Plato. Earlier it was only like, people from these urban rich colleges and universities who were fluent in Greek and Latin, and they could only like they only had access to Plato simply because they knew the language. But now, since the translation came out, it was like a revolution altogether. The common reader could also read Plato now. So uh, the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because uh, Plato was the first person who openly talked about homosexuality.
Yes.
So now, like, am I too fast? Oh,
No, it's
like,
okay. You are going really well. I mean, I'm enjoying it. Like you are in that zone of yours. So yeah, please go on. Go ahead.
yeah. So, I mean, so the reception of uh, Greek and Latin literature and Plato, to be specific, um, it completely altered the sexuality scene in Victorian England because people were reading Symposium, people were reading Phaedrus, people were reading all the other names that are not coming to my mind right now. But like people were reading Symposium. Symposium was made available to the common reader in 1871 when this guy Benjamin Jowett published the translation of Plato's works, and uh, the common reader would be like, okay, so is this even possible? Like, can uh, two men be in love with each other? They were like, having all these doubts and queries and questions, and they were like curious all of a sudden and it felt like people who were actually homosexual. It felt like you know, um, I don't know, it felt like a different world for them altogether because now they could relate to that. Now they could like openly talk about that. Okay, let's not even if like they could not, because in England, like they had like homosexuality was like criminalized up until 1960. So it was like, as you can see, like it was really late when they decided to like decriminalize homosexuality. So up until 1961, homosexuality was not talked about in England. So starting from the Victorian ages, but it was the Victorian age and Benjamin Jowett's translations that did did it for the homosexuals. That was like like we have uh, these days, these multiple like laws and acts against uh, heteronormativity. So um, it was like a cultural revolution altogether. Just the singular act of publication on Jowett's behalf. Uh, So, like people, even if they couldn't talk about homosexuality, they knew that it was not wrong. It was not, you know, whatever, however they are feeling within themselves. It is not something alien. Or, I mean, people throughout history, beginning from Plato, Plato is old, right? Plato is as ancient as, um, I don't know, so people like could finally understand that, okay, so like it is not something alien, whatever, however I'm feeling. If I'm getting attracted to another man, it's not something ridiculous or alien or impossible. It is like Plato reminded those common readers and common men all over England, because again, like we didn't not everybody had access to uh, English literature back then, but like they finally understood that, it's not even it's like not something out of the blue, and so not something impossible. So uh, that was something that I thought that would be interesting to bring up today. And up that, so
That is
what
actually
what
interesting,
happened?
to be honest, because I have also heard that homosexuality was quite famous in ancient Greek. I mean, it was prevalent. It was not something that was uh, hidden. So it's great that Plato bring this up, and now people are feeling that they belong somewhere. They are not alienated. So it's very important
Exactly.
for them, and really appreciate this fact. So yeah, please, please.
Yeah. So to talk a little bit about, please cut me uh, if I'm running out of time, or
No,
let
no,
me
it's
know.
okay.
And
You
please,
can
and
take your
feel
time.
free to like.
No, it's okay.
Okay, okay. So getting back to the concept of homosexuality as stated by Plato in ancient Greece, because um, he had a he had like uh, what should I say? Like he had an like the homosexuality which Plato mentions in his writings began with a certain archetype, like began with a certain uh, kind of relationship between two men, and then it evolved gradually across centuries to transcend to other kinds of attraction or bond or attachment or relationship. But initially, the archetype was that the relationship between two men would be a form of mentorship. There would be an older man and there would be a younger man. And older man would probably be in charge of mentoring the younger man. Mentoring in the context of personality, education, guidance, personal growth, uh, intellectual capabilities, faculties, and creative faculties in almost like every aspect of ancient Greek education, because they didn't have, like, obviously they did not have like subjects or disciplines like we do today. So these were some of the areas. So what would began as a form of mentorship would gradually uh, turn into an exchange for admiration and affection. So and it was all of this was legal socially. Like, can you imagine, like back in ancient Greece, this was like legal, but like up until 1960s in England, it was not. So feels really, really like, isn't it like really, I don't know, something to think about. And so
Civilization went backwards in a way.
backwards, of course. So so often like these two men would form a relationship outside of the mentorship only, and they would be often in love with one another and engage in uh, romantic and sexual exchanges. And so this was Plato had a term for it. It is called like he had a obviously a Greek term for it, but like the translation would be pederasty or pederastia. So pederasty is referred to this, this form of uh, mentorship that transcends like the boundaries of mentorship and eventually evolves to be something romantic and sexual between two men. So um, this was something the common English reader was coming across after Jowett translated all of this. So this is like really, really interesting to look at. Yeah. So what was I saying back then? I completely lost track of. Mm,
I mean, this is very interesting because all of a sudden, people from Victorian age are really getting the information. They are getting aware of the situation, and for the first time, they know their place. And this small revolution is very much important in order to trace back
it
the
was
history.
it was really, really impactful. So some people have called this the most significant event in the history of homosexual cultures in England. So, like, can you imagine the impact, the weight it had on uh, the the years to come, especially for queer people and homosexual people in England? But like here, homosexuality was to some extent like limited to like homosexuality between men, because this this brings me to a different conversation altogether. So like these learned men or like men or boys from upper class, mm, families, they were entering like colleges and like universities, and the common reader was also now after Jowett's translation, he had also like an access to Plato's literature now. But the reason why I'm saying I'm using a he instead of a they or a she is because women were all together, no matter which class they belonged to, they were all together, you know, uh, I had a word in mind, I'm forgetting. They were all together, like segregated and pushed aside. They were like pushed to the periphery of the of this educational narrative because they simply because like they were not allowed to go to schools. They were just they would be only learning knitting and maybe cooking and stuff like that at home. So education and women was again something something really uh, like at least in Victorian England it was really uh, like it was not getting contested, but it was uh, something that emerged very late. Like they were not allowed to like participate in all these social, cultural, educational uh, exchanges that were going on in the country. So they would be like sitting in a corner in their uh, decorated uh, rooms, and they would be knitting or maybe sewing or maybe cooking or learning those feminine arts. So altogether, like they would not be allowed to enter the this code that men were creating for themselves, and men would be only like it would be only men operating within this code. So um, what happened that they were as a result like of not being able to go to schools and not having like formal education. Of course they had informal education. This is how throughout history we have women uh, reading literature, women producing literature, women reading other women literature. We have Wollstonecraft, we have Jane Austen. All of these women, they did not have formal education. They only like whatever they produced, whatever they wrote about, whatever they knew, it was only informal, right? So uh, that was the scene was still the same in Victorian England. It was not changing up until the First and the Second World Wars. Women were still like they were like kept to the private circles, of families and of uh, you know so men would venture out of this private circles and they would go out and they would go to schools. They would learn about Plato. They would talk about Plato, whereas women were completely unaware of all these unless someone actually decides to uh, learn Latin on their own at home secretly. because if somebody gets to know about it, they would be punished severely because women were not allowed in these spheres at all. So um, they had a few schools though, where like schools were like beginning to open for women. So they were like sex segregated schools, but the education was nothing like the education men were receiving in the Oxbridge circles. So that is something. So what happened as a result? The entire reason why I mentioned this is that uh, it's very interesting to know that sometimes, like, they had these parties and gatherings and social gatherings and stuff during like the festivals and uh, occasions, right? Like I mean, people all over the world have. So, what happened during these parties is that men, they would, men who were like, who only know, sorry, or maybe like men who only, uh, men from the upper class. When, for instance, like take for instance, like families or boys from these really upper class, or I should say men, because by now they've all grown up and they are all married men. And of course, the wives would be uneducated in the conventional sense of the word, and they would not have access to the social public educational spheres like their husbands. So during these parties, when all these families, mostly upper class families, they would come together, uh, men would like most certainly have like a knowledge in Greek and Latin. They would talk to each other in these languages, and they would develop like a different code of talking to each other, which their wives would be completely unaware of. So can you imagine? It's like a secret code. Men in Victorian England, men who were learned, like who knew about, say, the two languages, which the common, let alone like women, the common man wouldn't have any idea of as well. So they would develop this secret cultural code to talk with each other, and sometimes they would even flirt with each other in this secret homosexual code. So we had like men, married men, with even children, they would often like flirt with each other and exchange love, sometimes in the form of letters as well, with each other in this secret language that nobody else was aware of, or simply because they didn't have access to that. So this was again happening in Victorian England. So men from these upper class uh, families who went to Oxbridge and had an idea of Greek and Latin, the languages, they would like talk to each other and flirt with each other, and share their amorous compliments and desires with each other, and operate in this secret, homosexual codes that nobody around them even had an iota of idea of, so. Uh, this is something really interesting to look at. I thought of bringing it up. So, um,
I mean, this is interesting. This is definitely interesting because first you were talking about how women were not allowed in this educational sphere, and even if they do, I mean,
mhm,
we know that writers such as George Eliot, who used to write using a pen name,
mhm,
because even if you are writing books, society will not gonna accept it. So that's why they are
exactly.
choosing a pen name. So and then this small code of language to
Homosexual
just
code.
hide this thing in front of everyone is very interesting. I think uh, I was completely unaware of this, so that is very interesting.
And this was happening after Jowett's translation, So we have these poets called, these Uranian group of poets, like poets like Walter Pater and forgetting the other ones, like Thomas Brown. I think it was Thomas Brown who wrote, the one who wrote Urn Burial. So yeah, anyway, so
Yes, yes.
these Uranian poets, yeah, okay, thank you. So these Uranian poets would be, uh, including Wilde, they would be developing this homosexual counter discourse, and they would be talking about that with each other in those um, limited circles, and justify male love or higher, like, drawing from Plato, of course, like male love in ideal or like transcendental terms, something Plato was talking about. So, um, again, something really interesting to look at is, about the Oscar Wilde trial, right? So
Yes, it's
he was,
interesting. I would love to
yeah.
know in detail because I don't know much about it. So, can you please enlighten us?
So I can't say I know a lot on it, but like, this is relevant to the topic that we are talking about. So Wilde was a married man. So okay, let me get back to even earlier than that. So Wilde was initially like he had his education from Ireland, from like I think Trinity College in Dublin. So but then his life like took a different path after he moved to London, and he began like uh, interacting with these intellectual circles in London and in England all over. He got married. He had, I think, two children, if I'm not wrong. But like, he was again like again he was highly active and interactive in these social circles. The kind of circles that I was just talking about before, like where people from only upper class, I shouldn't say people, or rather men from upper class families, uh, Oxbridge educated men, Greek and Latin educated men would operate in. He belonged to one of those circles. So he had a lot of interactions with men, uh, you know, uh, and he would often be in love with a few, if not in a relationship. He would be, of course, in love with a few. But the most, like, of course, we all know about Lord Alfred Douglas, like I think he was his last lover and the most serious one. I think something that inspired his um, the portrait of Dorian Gray. So I don't know. I mean, people seem to say that it was Lord Alfred Douglas who inspired his portrait of Dorian Gray, but like I'm not sure because in his letters, I think he did not mention anything about um, Douglas and Dorian Gray. So there's still like a debate as to what actually was the inspiration behind Dorian Gray. It could be some people say that it was himself and his own desire to like get back to uh, youth that inspired it. But anyway, so he would have this uh, really really enduring love affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, and by the name Lord Alfred Douglas, you can probably guess that he was also someone from high esteem. Like we have the word Lord in the name, so uh, he was also someone from. Uh, he was a son of a marquess, actually. So he was a son of the Marquis of Queensberry, which is a county around London itself. So while was going on with his these amorous exchanges and letters with Alfred Douglas, who was also in love with Wilde, and who, with equal potency, like returned those exchanges and those confessions and declarations of love, and were like in a full-fledged, relationship for about 2 years when Lord Alfred Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, gets to know about their affair, and he just he sues Wilde in court, and for his acts of gross indecency. This is I'm borrowing from like uh, uh, the court language that was used in Oscar Wilde's trial. So. Uh, like the Marquis of Queensberry, he sues Oscar Wilde, and then Oscar Wilde, after 3 years of intense discussions or conversations with, or just advices and suggestions from his intellectual circles and friends and lawyers, of course, decides to sue him back. And so, a conversation was going on in the form of suing one another between the Marquis of Queensberry, or Lord Alfred Douglas's father, and Oscar Wilde. Uh, but like ultimately it was the Marcus who won, because when Oscar Wilde countersued, um, the Marquis brought in evidences of multiple young men that Oscar Wilde slept with. And the reason why I use the word slept with is that he even, can you believe, like he even, like I'm talking about the Marquis of Queensberry, he even brought in Oscar Wilde's chambermaids and housemaids and all the house help and domestic help people to testify against him. And they did. They testified against their own owner. Like they were like, yes, we found like multiple men coming and going in Oscar Wilde's rooms and hotels and like you know, and we would find fecal stains in on the bed sheets. So, they would also testify against him. So after that, like Wilde had to take a step because it was like um, hard found evidence against that, and no lawyer on earth back in the Victorian times had the um, expertise to counter that, to defend that. So he had to take a step back, and he was even like suggested by his friends to flee to France or any other country. The reason why they mentioned France or suggested him to flee to France was that in France, homosexuality was decriminalized as early as the French Revolution. So, somewhere around like 1790 to 1800-ish, French people would have homosexuality out in the open. Like they have what England did for maybe 2 centuries later. France did it way back. Uh, so Wilde's friends would be suggesting him to flee to France or somewhere homosexuality was um, legalized or not criminalized. So he did not actually flee to France. He took a step back. He was in London only. Uh, and after a couple more months, uh, there was again another accusation against him, where it was where officials would just come to Wilde's room suddenly, all of a sudden, and would actually ask him to take off his pants so that they can check if he has committed acts of gross indecency or sodomy. So sodomy was a term that was like homosexuality as a term entered the our linguistic uh, discourse way later. Earlier, homosexuality was referred to as sodomy or sodomite. So, uh, Wilde would be referred to as like a sodomite back in Victorian England. Like sodomy or sodomite was the word to refer to homosexuals. Uh, people who would have like sexual intercourse, uh, men who would have sexual intercourse were referred to as sodomites. So that was the charge against Oscar Wilde. Like he was a sodomite, and all these newspapers would have the days following the accusation and the trial against Wilde. All these newspapers would have these headlines calling out Wilde as a moral leper, as someone who, as someone who is uh, impurating or like polluting the morality, the high Victorian morality that Victorian England so highly relied on and looked up to. So the what was the conclusion of the trial? Uh, so he would finally be found guilty of all those accusations and charges, and he would be sent to prison in um for I think, yeah, that is where he died. I think it was Reading Gaol, where he also composed his last play. Somewhere at the peripheries, suburbs of England, like this prison. I'm forgetting the name of it. I had it in mind a few minutes back, but I'm forgetting it right now. I'm so sorry. But uh, that was the conclusion of the trial. So he would be sent to this prison. He would, of course, not be sentenced to death, uh, But had it been like a couple of years ago, he would be sentenced to death because England was still going through like a revision of all these laws where it would mostly be imprisonment or death penalty. So it was only a few matters of time that Wilde could escape the death penalty, because had it been a few decades ago, earlier, he would be like, he would be tried, and he would be uh, charged. I mean, he would be what, like, uh, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. You're completely audible, and maybe he would face severe consequences. So that is what you wanted to say.
Mm, Uh, the severe consequence here in this context would be death. So he would be charged with the death penalty. So it was like England was going through these revisions of laws and and acts where uh, they would only, like, the revision was only in the section of the in the context to the punishment. So it would be either capital punishment or death penalty or life imprisonment. So it was a narrow escape for Wilde, and he got the latter. Like, he got uh, the imprisonment. He was sent to this prison in the where ultimately he died. So for the last 3 years of his life, he was in that prison, and that is where he composed the ballad of Reading Gaol, because Reading Gaol was probably the name of the prison, if I'm not wrong. I need to again fact check, but that was like the end to the to this entire, like, uh, accusation and counter accusation that was going on in Wilde's life. And in the meantime, on the other hand, Lord Alfred Douglas would sit at home and helpless, because it was, after all, his father who accused his lover, and he would sit at home and he would compose poetry for Wilde mostly, and I don't know if he could get them published during his lifetime, but he would be like helpless sitting at home. It's also interesting to know that coincidentally, or I don't know, maybe intentionally as well, it could be intentional as well. So, uh, Wilde was the older man in the relationship, and Alfred Douglas was the younger one. So, you know, unknowingly, unconsciously, they somewhere reinforced Plato's archetype, like younger and older man, forming a sort of mentorship that would eventually transcend into something more than the mentorship. So Alfred Douglas was 16 years younger to Wyatt. So maybe they were subconsciously, or I don't know if it was intentional or not. I don't think, uh, we fall in love, we control the conditions of us falling in love. But nonetheless, so they would somewhere subconsciously, reinforce Plato's idea of paiderastia or paiderasty. So that is something important to look at. But Oscar Wilde's trial was so significant right after Jowett's translation, because now people knew that homosexuality, no matter how criminalized it was in the public, it was something real. It was something, people around them were going through something like that. So it kind of uh, assured them, and more people eventually in the modern age would begin talking about it. But in the Victorian England, people, like homosexuality was limited to like a form of self assurance or self identity, where people were more and more people were coming out. The phrase that we use these days, were they were coming out, but they were not, instead of coming out to the public, they were simply coming out to themselves. So they were recognizing, they were coming to terms with their own sexuality, all thanks to Plato, all thanks to Jowett's translation, all thanks to Oscar Wilde's trial. So it was much later in the um, uh, modern England that people would start writing about it and coming out in public, in the literal sense. Uh, but in until the 19th century, they were just coming to terms with their own sexuality. They were recognizing, they were going through a self-identification, self-recognition in the context of sexuality. So that was something really
That
interesting to look at.
that was amazing. I mean, I learned so many new things about how everything was then in Victorian England, and the story was sad compared to, I mean,
Or
what
wild.
had to face.
Yeah.
But do you see any resemblance with that of 19th century Victorian England with today's India? By any chance, if I ask?
Of course. Of course, of course. I mean, the, although like I would say that the scene is a little better in India because uh now we at least legally we don't have homosexuality criminalized. It is decriminalized thanks to all the people who have actively fought and uh, stood by their like people who have been resolute and they stood by their ambitions. We need more and more people like that today. But I think the scene is a little better here in India, and but yes, much more. The production of queer, the scholarship and production of queer literature has inspired people all over from you know transcending boundaries of class, geography, language. I mean, we have like queer literature produced today in almost all the languages. People from all over India, because right now we're talking about India, people from all over the country are talking more and more about their queerness, their bodily lived sexual queer lives, right? So uh, I think the scene is a lot better. Uh, Self-recognition wise, but I'm not sure if it is any better uh, social acceptance wise, because I think that's again a gray area in India, and it'll take few more years, at least a decade more, to to for the scene to change. You know, I think social acceptance of homosexuality is something still that needs to be uh, fought for, and you know, you know,
Exactly, exactly.
that is
It was a very enriching lecture, to be honest. I mean, the way you just guided this lecture from Plato to then you connect with Victorian literature and how Plato's works actually influenced Victorian people, and then you are
Mhm.
like going ahead with that. So it was a very detailed and enriched lecture, and I'm really glad that you came here. I know we are already running out of time, right? We have already crossed the limit, but still, thank you so much for being here. I know it's Thanksgiving over there in USA, so
It
extra
is.
thanks
Yeah.
from my side. I'm really happy that you came here. And for those who are watching
Thank you
this right
so
now,
much for.
we are very good friends. I mean, we are still good friends, but
Yeah.
we miss the campus life, right?
Yeah. We miss hanging out. We miss talking about these things in person. We would have so many intellectual, enriching conversations like this, and even more about almost everything, not only about literature, right? So, yeah, of course, miss those days.
Exactly, and especially
What can be done?
I miss the way we used to play chess. I mean, those chess matches.
Yeah.
So
I'm actually like so out of touch from chess now, and I like you reminded me, like I need to get playing chess. Yeah. Are
so
you in touch with chess like that? Are you playing these days?
no, I don't love it when I play in online. I just love to play with someone in front of me. So,
Like the real
yeah, the real feeling of chess. That's really.
chess, chessboard and all. Yeah.
So I know it's been a very enriching lecture, and thank you so much for joining here. And if you are really interested in, I mean, I'm not talking to you now. I'm talking to the audience now. I'm breaking the fourth wall.
Of course,
So
I get it.
if
Yeah.
you all are interested in Victorian literature, then you can join in this community. We have YouTube channel, and you can also join the Facebook group. So we will have multiple such videos like this one. And I'm again giving a huge thanks to Pratyusha for joining here. I'm really happy and glad
Thank
that you
you.
joined here. So thank you so
Thank you so
much.
much for the invite, Ritam.
Thank you so
And
much.
everyone who is interested in like in receiving such enriching. I mean, I won't say my
No, no, it
conversation
was
was enriching,
enriching.
and
It was
that's
enriching.
for that 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 was for you guys to decide. But please follow Victorian Vanguard because Preetham is an amazing guy, and you know, it was because of his initiative that I'm here today and we're having this conversation. So please feel like, please, like it's a. I would be personally like following and keeping a track as well. So my suggestion would be to do the same. Like very like again like very impressive initiative, Preetham. Honestly,
Thank you so much, Pratyusha. So I'm really happy that you came here. And so, with
hmm
that being said, we are ending it here. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and to the audience,
you too.
have a great night because it's already quite late here, I guess. So,
Yeah.
but the video
I'm
will
so
be,
sorry. I completely lost track of time in between.
but it was amazing. So yeah, uh, let's bye bye, and we are ending this stream here. But you will find multiple such videos on this channel. So thank you for coming here.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.